Yes.
A hot mama jama?
Wait a minute. Something's wrong. I feel something coming over me. I can't. What? I am the very model of a modern major general of information vegetable animal and mineral. I know the kings of England and I quote the fights historical from Marathon to Waterloo in order categorical. I'm very well acquainted too with matters mathematical. I understand equations both the simple and quadratical. In binomial theorem I am teeming with a lot of news and many careful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. I'm very good at integral and differential calculus. I know the scientific names of beings animalculous and sort in matters vegetable, animal, and mineral. I am the very model of a mother major general. I count the flying saucers and I know that they are very bright. His shook hands was of Bigfoot and his grip was very, very tight. The Loch Ness monster drinks with me and downs more gin than sight can see. Intelligence refers to me as horrible and dastardly. In certain matters vegetable, animal, and mineral, I am the very mortal of a modern major general. What's going on?
That's very well done.
What are you talking about?
I don't know. My memory's been erased.
Well, good.
I have a screen memory though of this odd vision. It's not owls, but a pair of buttocks creeping gently over the countryside, and there's a low rumbling noise, and I just remember this distinctive noise, and that's it.
Well, that sounds like a Woody Allen film I saw. Only, in that case, it was a giant pair of mammary glands that were roving through the countryside. They were unstoppable.
Well, perhaps we could discuss some of the contents of those two PDF documents. It seemed to me for a long time that there was something fishy about some of these guys who were coming forward over the past few decades with insider information. And there seemed to be a certain category. They all had similar traits. They came out with exotic tales of what the U.S. government was doing in relation to the extraterrestrial problem. And they had very fishy backgrounds. Sometimes they had multiple names. And they often claimed that, the reason for the multiple names was that the intelligence community had, or whoever they were with in the intelligence world, had created the names for them, and then their fishy backgrounds was due in part to the fact that their, time at MIT, for example, had been erased by the CIA or whoever it was, and so on and so forth. One notable case is this guy named Dan Burisch, or that was the name he was giving at the time, and of course he was a big story for Linda Moulton Howe. Another guy who fits the same category more or less is Bob Lazar, the Area 51 guy, and I believe there are one or two others. And it occurred to me some time ago that with all this talk of MK Ultra and inducing multiple personalities and the Manchurian candidate effect where you program a perfect assassin, that there was an even easier apple to grasp there lower on the tree when it comes to the possible uses of a person who's been so programmed, and that would be disinformation. You take a person and using whatever method they use, you program them with all sorts of specialized knowledge and a legend, quote unquote. The background, the bio, what they've done, some of their experiences. Then when you release them into the wild, they're perfect for disinformation because they believe what they say. They themselves say, for the most part. So I sort of connected the dots on that. And that's concept number one, or speculation number one. Speculation number two, as an extension of that, is that the very idea of splitting personalities and turning people into these sort of Manchurian candidates itself comes from the alien abduction phenomenon. If it weren't for this phenomenon as we think we know it from the late 40s onward, it may never have occurred to them to attempt this. Right now, it's easy to assume that the context of the Cold War environment was what brought this about, because with all of the espionage and so on, obviously you want someone who won't crack under pressure, who will be resistant to interrogation techniques. But what if, really, the reason why this was thought up was because of abductees? And you can envision a certain line of reasoning to go along with this. So people are being taken aboard these spaceships or wherever the hell they're going, and they're being sent back. They don't remember what the hell happened, but they've been told certain things. Sometimes they start passing on these messages. Sometimes they don't remember. Sometimes they're told, you'll remember these things when the time comes. If you are the clandestine side of the national security state, it would stand to reason that you're going to be concerned about this sort of thing. And that probably the first stage of concern would touch on things like infrastructure, military infrastructure particularly. What are these people being programmed to do? Will they go blow up our bridges? Will they go blow up our nuclear power plants? Will they go running into military bases and doing all that sort of thing, sabotaging our weaponry? To our knowledge, that has never really occurred in any big way. So probably the thinking would have evolved to the next stage, which is, well, they're not doing anything to our infrastructure or the things that we really care about. But what they are doing apparently is propaganda. You've got these contactees who are spreading these messages of all sorts of varieties, and then you've got the UFO enthusiasts who are effectively, vehicles for disseminating all these ideas by publishing their books and holding their conferences and so on. So the suspicion then, the target of the suspicion changes to maybe these people are being used as cultural weapons or, propaganda vehicles. So that would explain a lot of the meanness of the kind of counterintelligence efforts directed against the UFO community and abductees and so on and so forth. And going even further from that, it would account for the so-called MILAB events, the military abductions, so-called, where people experience all of the usual abduction characteristics, but these events seem to be driven or controlled by military types, human beings. And they are, brutal sometimes and traumatizing and so on. Well, there again, you might have an intelligence establishment trying to reverse engineer or reconstruct from the ground up what happens in an abduction in order to figure out what these abductions are, in order to get into the mind of the enemy and figure out what they might be used for. So those are some of the main ideas.
Well, to presuppose that these programs in the intelligence community are modeled after the alien abduction phenomena is to suppose that the alien abduction phenomena was well understood and documented at around the time that the intelligence programs were taking off. Whereas I doubt that they were able to get a grip on the patterns, because how would they be able to identify abductees before alien abduction became a cultural phenomenon? Most of these people draw attention to themselves.
if not by appearing on Geraldo or Ricky Lake back in the mid-90s when abduction was the rage in mainstream popular culture, um, then by communicating with a support group or a regressive hypnotist, sending letters to Whitley Strieber. These people disclose their own presence. But early on, at the time where this sort of splitting personality thing was happening, um, there were no cultural frameworks for people to announce themselves as an abductee. And thus, how would these intelligence types have gotten a grip on the patterns and the phenomenon?
Well, in this sort of counter narrative I'm um, presenting, the way that it all unfolds in the course of time is important, but you can distinguish between the type of concern for contactees being used as sleeper cells, for example, and the later MILAB events, which are hard to imagine absent the broader cultural awareness of the abduction phenomenon. You know, the contactee events of the 50s, a lot of people don't realize were actually pretty extensive. You had all sorts of people coming out, and there is plenty of continuity between the contactee period, so-called, and the abductee period. You had a lot of the same characteristics, but to the extent that contact was happening in the 50s, all that would be required is people being taken by some foreign power, people being returned without a clear and complete memory of what occurred, and people spreading messages supposedly derived from their experiences. Now, you don't necessarily need all of the rest of the abduction hallmarks. You don't need the examinations and the table. You don't need the grays necessarily. You don't need a lot of the other stuff. But if you have people who are being taken and they're under the control of somebody else, and they have any kind of experience of, you know, not necessarily missing time, because that's usually associated with a gap or a discontinuity in your experience on the surface, so to speak. But to the extent that there are any kind of mental anomalies or discrepancies in the experiences themselves, you could easily suspect that these people are under some kind of mental control, or perhaps being subject to mental controls that they aren't aware of. And when they're coming back and disseminating these messages, you might say, well, these two are probably connected. You know, people, even in the contactee era, supposedly underwent profound life changes after these contacts took place. That in itself is a kind of discontinuity. And the type of life changes that you might observe might not directly seem exculpable when it comes to, the experiences themselves. So I think it's possible that this scenario could hold. All they would have to do is be suspicious of what was really being done with the people and want to try to account for life changes, for example, and why they're disseminating these alien messages. And if there's a suggestion of hypnosis or mental control or superior mental power, which does show up often enough, then all of these dots might be connected.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not as familiar with the contactee literature as you seem to be. Um, but isn't it the case that the idea of missing time and screen memories and so on only became a part of the literature on contact with the beginning of abduction proper, involving the Greys and so on. Because a lot of these contactees, to my recollection and from my exposure to it, seem to have been in an ordinary state of consciousness. You know, the person comes out, announces that he's from Venus or Mercury or what have you, shakes hands, imparts some message about world peace or environmentalism, and basically maybe he takes them on a ride to the moon, maybe there's some kind of sexual interaction, maybe they all drop a bunch of acid. I mean, who knows? But the fact remains, they're in a normal state of consciousness. The memory doesn't have to be coaxed out of them. It's basically as if someone were to drive up to my house right now, say, hello, my name is Frank, and then walk away politely.
Well, compared to the so-called abductee era, there is certainly a greater presence of what we call ordinary consciousness, but there is a bit of the other as well. Even in the Betty and Barney Hill case, you had, gaps in the memories of what was happening when they're on the supposed ship. You had discrepancies between the amount of time that must have transpired while they were, experiencing the things that they experienced and what happened when they got back. And I believe that there are other cases as well. Now, screen memories, of course, are a different thing. And I could be wrong on this, but I don't believe screen memories appear until the abductee era. But I think there are enough elements in the contactee era, for example, telepathy and, the mesmerizing effect of different beings and so on. It's perhaps not as a unified theme as in the abductee era, but I am willing to bet that there's enough of it in the contactee era, from what I've heard and read, that it's possible that an intelligence organization might connect the dots in that way.
If we take Betty and Barney Hill as the paradigmatic example of memories needing to be recovered, before which we're definitively in the contactee era, where the memories are in full consciousness, that brings us to a little bit of a conflict, because the interrupted journey didn't appear until 1966, whereas a program like MK Ultra was going on in the early 1950s and officially sanctioned in 1953. So that particular CIA program and this particular example, bear out what I'm proposing as a potential conflict. I would propose an alternative interpretation for the parallel, being that pursuing similar goals yields similar methodologies. Take, for example, the fact that the Greys, in as much as they're abducting people, and it's not the broader category of experiences that people report involving the Greys, because I don't want to reduce that whole phenomena to the lying on a table, cultivation of genetic material scenario, because the fact of the matter is that the phenomena is a lot broader and more diverse and more paradoxical than that. But nevertheless, if we just take the abduction aspect of it, you can find a lot of significant parallels between an abduction and how we deal with animals in the wild. Take primates. We tag them. We release them back into the wild in order to observe their behavior. We collect specimens. We observe them from a distance. We try not to interfere. The way that we interact with these groups of wild animals is not dissimilar from the way that the Greys interact in these abduction scenarios. Now, can we infer from that that zoologists are emulating the visitors? No, I don't think it's reasonable. However, there's a commonality, there's a similarity of intent, and that similarity of intent can yield a similar system of methodologies without there being direct emulation involved.
Well, what you're proposing as the alternate view is, in fact, the accepted view, and I'm not suggesting that that is definitely wrong. In other words, it may very well be simply an accident of history that these MK Ultra experiments were going on, and they might very well have organically arisen out of the conflict with the Soviet Union and the so-called Cold War and so on. And it could simply be rooted in the basis of human consciousness and intelligence that, at least in the story advanced by Strieber, for example, that the supremely stressful conditions of something like an MK Ultra project will crack the cosmic egg and then leave those victims susceptible to, a more direct perception of these other realities. That may very well be the case. The idea, though, only requires that those in the intelligence world, however you define the boundaries there, had more information about the nature and the circumstances of contact in, for example, the 50s than we think they did, or more than we had, for example. And you can find in the UFO lore some ideas to support this. I mean, you have the stories, for example, of some sort of early governmental contact in the 50s. You've got the Eisenhower meeting, supposedly, with extraterrestrials. You can take that however you like. You have the suggestion that even those, like a Strieber who was born in the 40s and whose earliest otherworldly experiences apparently took place in the 50s, even those people come out of bloodlines where this sort of thing had happened previously. So if encounters were happening previously, which is possible, then it's possible that somebody had knowledge of those contacts that only much later started to come out into the mainstream. Now, again, that's just it's a major what if, and it goes against the currents of the usual UFO myth, which is we knew nothing about contact until Roswell, and even then we had to wait ages for the contactee movement, or rather at least a decade for there to be any real variety of face-to-face contact, and then we had to wait more decades until a completely different type of contact took over with the abductee era without ever explaining the differences between the two, so on and so forth.
Well, I think that it's possible that synthesis could be achieved between the conventional account and the narrative that you propose, because it could be that the similarities began as an accident of history, but of course any intelligent person will want to emulate anything that seems successful in the activities of a perceived enemy. And so it could be that there is some degree of historical accident which was followed by deliberate emulation on the part of the intelligence community. And it only makes sense because I imagine that we wouldn't simply try to study their technology. We would try to study how they think. What sorts of beings are they? How are they influencing us? How do they perceive us? I mean, we do this kind of psychological analysis. They do it in the FBI when they're pursuing a killer. The CIA does it, perceiving, trying to see, well, how does the Taliban see the world? How does Al-Qaeda perceive the U.S. and the West in general? Of course, they would do it with these guys. And how are these, how are these terrorist organizations? How are the Russians able to exert control over their population, over their supporters? Well, they would do it with the visitors as well. So it only stands to reason that we would look at them from a psychological standpoint in as much as we're able, and we might try to apply some of that.
Well, I agree. The thing that strikes me about what we're talking about, the case that MILAB events are reconstructions or reverse engineerings of so-called alien abductions, that's a case that could be more strongly made because, they're more recent and so on and so forth, and because of the circumstances attending to those events. The notion that the MK Ultra stuff might also have been an attempt to reconstruct or reverse engineer is pure speculation, but that's the speculation I was advancing. Nevertheless, the idea that you would attempt to reconstruct in order to understand, to me, is striking in all of this. Because it's one thing to attempt to reason, as Sherlock Holmes might do, attempt to reason things out from the perspective of, whoever it is that you're trying to understand, to follow their steps mentally, to think mentally what their aims are. But it's a whole other thing to attempt to actually physically stage the events so as to supposedly better understand them. And in the context of these things, I mean, the idea that you would actually abduct people in order to better understand abductions is hilarious in a way. But there's reason to suppose that these things are going on. You have two anecdotes from Strieber himself, for example, the story that he's told more recently about being in Paris with the family. And the family went out because he was supposedly ill, and some people knocked at the door and said that they could induce missing time. Would he like to find out how it's done, or would he like to participate somehow? So he brought him inside, and he asked if he could record the conversation or whatever, and they said no, but they had a tape recorder or something like that. And they said, what we will do is let you hear what is said while, you're out. And he said, okay. And then they just started playing the tape, and he was shocked that the missing time event had apparently already occurred. And then afterward, he couldn't even remember what was on the tape. So anyway, you have two normal human beings, supposedly, who are French, who, according to Strieber, can induce missing time. Then you've got the story of the implant itself that was supposedly put into his ear, he claims, by two people who looked perfectly human, and not in the sort of, blonde Nordic sense human, but ordinary human. And there was some English language speech going on. He heard a voice, maybe from the backyard, saying code red or something like that, condition red. Anyway, there was nothing that suggested anything extraterrestrial in that event either. But here you have the possibility that an implant's being put in by perfectly terrestrial, agencies. So, you could suppose that only more recently have they been doing this sort of thing, but it's possible that maybe because of some accident of history that we don't know about, that all of this stuff with MK Ultra and the crazy experiments they were doing with kids, again, according to Strieber, and all this kind of stuff, came from some things that they knew and still know that we have no idea about.
Well, it's possible. I mean, obviously, we have access only to a part of the data set, and they have access only to another segment of the data set. The only people who have complete knowledge of the situation are the visitors. I don't think it's unreasonable to suppose that we would try to follow up on their success and exert a similar influence on our own population. The underlying psychology of these organizations seems to be that you can never be secure enough. But since security entails control, it follows quickly thereafter that you can never have enough control. Part of the problem with the advent of democracy, both from the perspective of those who wish to hoard and maintain power, and from the perspective of those of us who have to deal with ever more subtle forms of control and manipulation, is that once a population is democratized and there's the establishment of basic rights, it's no longer possible to control people by force, at least not outright in the open. And it becomes necessary to control their minds. So, of course, these organizations whose task it is to maintain security and thus control have to move into the frontier of controlling the mind. Now, when you want to do something, you look at the people who seem most able to do it. You emulate their techniques and you go ahead and do it. So why not? Why wouldn't they apply what the visitors are doing? Apparently with much success. The visitors seem able to induce a state of concern for humanity, of concern for the possibility of ecological and nuclear devastation, a sense of interconnectedness with the rest of life. On the high end of the spectrum. On the low end of the spectrum, you've got fear, paranoia, social disengagement. So it seems like they can do whatever they want. It seems like there's this wide spectrum of the way people react to the experiences and the types of experiences that happen. And so there's this broad range of things to study. So, of course they would. The question is, at what point did this begin, and to what extent has it occurred?
Well, there's a troubling aspect to that, to me, and that is that, it's assumed by people who, are aware that all this stuff is occurring. It's taken for granted by them that the history of human contact, right, is basically what's happening right now in the public sphere. In other words, among this small subculture of a subculture of people who grant a basic reality to what's going on, they think that, when the history of human contact with the otherworldly is written, it will be restricted to their efforts and their experiences and so on and so forth. Well, this is just deranged, because the fact is that the book of human contact, right, if we just pretend for a moment that in modern history it started, in the 1940s, half of the book has been going on in secret. We know nothing about it. When people are in the intelligence field, and if there are people who have, in their capacity as intelligence operatives, agents, whatever, actually interacted with otherworldly beings, or even if they have knowledge about it, or if they have been witness to events, or if they've watched films, or if they've handled materials, or they've been privy to certain kinds of hushed whispers, all of that too constitutes the history of human contact. These people are human beings. It's not like you've got two species, the people outside the intelligence establishment and the people inside. No, all of this is all part of the same story of human contact. And who knows how much has been going on behind the scenes and what it all amounts to. So that's why it occurred to me that, you know, it would make a certain kind of sense that the MK Ultra type stuff, of which we know very little, might have come out of an alternate history of contact that's been going on in secret that the rest of us, you know, haven't glimpsed at all. And, you know, moreover, that I think I complained about this once before, that, you know, as much as everyone believes that, you know, the abductees or the contactees, whatever term you want to use, these are the people who are, in a way, humanity's representatives, that these people are at the forefront. It's not necessarily so. Because you have all of these other people, presumably, who we might agree aren't really working on humanity's behalf. I mean, these people who are working on the behalf of secrecy, those people are just as equally at the forefront, and they represent and reflect humanity as a whole. So what they are doing reflects on us, and who knows what the hell they've been doing.
Well, I wonder whether it's a bit too much of a carryover from our own somewhat primitive military history to imagine that there is such a thing as the forefront. Seen as how this is happening on multiple vertices. You know, as you yourself have noted, part of the foolhardiness of anyone who opposes the visitors and their apparent agenda lies in supposing that there is such a thing as a single victory condition, that if you can thwart that, you've thwarted their agenda. Well, as you said, part of their mastery, their atemporality, their multidimensional nature is, and even foregoing all of that, if we bracket all of that and just assume that they're not atemporal, they're not multidimensional, their advanced level of intelligence and consciousness would entail that there are any number of potential victory scenarios or partial victories or circumstances from which they can rescue, some advances even from almost complete collateral damage, is enormous. It's such an enormous range of possible conditions that thwarting them becomes impossible and thus foolhardy. When we're interacting with that kind of presence, we have to ask ourselves, is there such a thing as the forefront? Because this is something that's coming at us from every side. It's interacting on one front with the people who perceive themselves to be in power in our society, very much like placating and assuaging the alpha male, as we've said in the past, if we were going to go with the primate analogy, dealing with people as individuals, dealing with our popular culture and our perception of them. I mean, because part of Strieber's platform is that these guys want to be called the Greys for philosophical reasons, that they are communicating through the medium of our pop culture representations of them. You know, these are specific assertions that Strieber has made. These guys don't have to pull you out of your house in the middle of the night and wake you up to influence you. If we attribute the properties to them that Strieber does and that much of the UFO abduction community does, they're interacting with us on every possible level from every possible direction. So there is no forefront at all.
Well, you're not wrong when you talk about the extent of their possible influence or the effect that they have on us, but I think it's fair to say that there is a forefront when you distinguish between people who have had contact experience and people who have not. Now, I'm not saying it's a rigorous, absolute distinction, but You know, what I'm thinking of when I say forefront, I'm thinking of, for example, in the key, the tapestry of memory, or elsewhere where Strieber says that all of life, for example, viewed four-dimensionally, you know, is a kind of work of art, which means it's a kind of completed object. And if you were to, for perfectly human reasons, decide to draw a circle around contact and say, well, we're going to look at contact as the sum of interactions between human beings and these others. If you were to take, for example, the giant book of every single interaction and say, well, this constitutes the history of interaction between human beings and these other people. Well, how much of it is admirable? How much of it is a disgrace? And to me, in a way, that's an urgent question, because we need to know. In part, again, going back to a Strieber idea, yes, it's true that their mastery is manifold, at least that's the way it appears, but another apparent side of these visitors is that, you know, things have consequences. They get the little stories about how they give one chance, you know, for this or that, or the other thing, and you make your choice, and after that, it's irrevocable. Well, we don't know what kind of irrevocable choices are being made, and if we're not all involved, there are all sorts of choices that are being made on our behalf, in a way, in our name, or names that we could be totally ignorant of. I mean, we could be damned for history, for all time, without ever knowing why. If somebody somewhere fucks up and does something which sends human history and human development on a different course, there's never any perfect control or absolute knowledge when it comes to things like that, but the human impulse for justice, in a way, demands that this be known by all and that all be able to participate.
Well, you know, I don't know what to make of this one choice aspect of the literature, because I'm sure we can't apply it as such a, you know, absolute criteria for like how they think and how they operate. Because I mean, to just apply that across the board as a unilateral principle would be, you know, grossly tyrannical, and it harkens to the idea of an angry Old Testament Yahweh making a pronouncement, setting up a certain number of conditions, and then when it's not satisfied, dispensing wrath. I think there's some truth to it, inasmuch as if we assume the beings are atemporal, you know, inasmuch as you make a single choice, they can perceive in that choice the totality of the consequences in the evolution of your own being. On the other hand, you know, so part of what I would argue is that we can't assume that it's an absolute principle that characterizes their behavior in every situation, however much truth there may be in it. However, it is the case that these people, these intelligence types, are taking actions that reflect on who we are as a species, and they tell the truth about part of the story of who we are as a species. We are basically empty of inherent existence. We all have the same fundamental potentialities. And depending on our choices and decisions, we can actualize those potentialities either in the direction of the good or in the direction of the worship of entropy, in the direction of destruction, in the direction of the dissolution of our consciousness. You know, we can be anything. That is part of, that is what makes us good, is our capacity to choose either way. Either way, otherwise we'd be automatons. So, nevertheless, it's reflecting a choice on what we're choosing to be, what we're doing with the gift of sentience that we have. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a shame, but if all are responsible for all, then we are responsible for what uh, the military and the intelligence communities do. We're responsible for what the corporations do to the environment. We're responsible for what the financial sector does to the dispossessed. All of it is the responsibility of all of us.
I agree. I agree. I think the meaning of that is clear when it comes to ultimate responsibility, which in a way is the only kind of responsibility, but we are ultimately responsible for everything that happens. I've always read the sort of tyrannical side of the so-called visitors, the sort of one choice for all of time dimension to Strieber's accounting of them as being their acknowledgement of the absolute singularity of events and even individual moments. If you're able to perceive the absolute singularity of a given moment or event, but also realize the way that, well, let's say not all moments are equal. In other words, if it's come time for you to make some sort of important choice, the moment of that choosing is not equal to 10 moments before when you're walking down the corridor coming up to it. Ultimately, both are absolutely singular. But after you've made this choice, certain possibilities will be foreclosed. And there are certain times in life when those decisions are made. And when it comes to interacting with them, apparently they make a big deal out of that.